As you may know, I have been goading and pushing and hoping that ICANN would be coming up with a new GTLD process since 1999. Be careful what you ask for. I expected the new GTLD process to be more restrictive than I would have liked it to be. I think the idea of $100,000 entry fees, of financial and business requirements that a startup has to be operating an infrastructure like .coms is excessive and unnecessary, but I knew that this is a much more conservative community and there are interests involved, and I expected some trade-offs. I did not expect the new TLD process to openly and explicitly introduce a regime of global censorship. I did not expect standards of morality and public order to be inserted into the string selection process. And that indeed is exactly where we have gone. We are taking dramatic steps into new territory. I think we have to be very aware of this, that there is a precedent being set here. There has never been a global regime for the regulation of media content. The 1860 ITU treaty that Wolfgang mentioned did contain some restrictions, but that was a European game. It had absolutely no application to the United States or Asia at the time, and it wasn't that hard for the rather mercantilistic and authoritarian states of mid-19th century Europe to reach agreement on the nature of what information should be regulated. What we're doing now is very different, very different. We are in effect saying that we are going to create a global institutional mechanism for deciding what kinds of words cannot be published, purely on the basis of the strings, mind you. We're not talking about the content under the strings. We're not talking about the way the strings are used. We are saying that this community and the governments that participate in it will be able to censor particular words from ever appearing in the domain name space at the top level. Now, if you're going to do this, at the very least, be careful, okay? And don't be one-sided. So, for example, the original phrasing says something like, the recommendation 6, number 3 says the process for introducing new GTLDs must make proper allowance for prior third-party rights, in particular trademark rights. Now, why wouldn't you want to say also that it must make amends or take into account prior freedom of expression rights? As simply as a matter of balance, both of these are written into various kinds of national and international law. Why wouldn't you simply be balanced and say, as the NCUC amendment drafted by Robin proposed, the process for introducing new GLTs must make proper allowance for third-party rights, including trademark and freedom of expression rights? What is so difficult or unreasonable about that? It's a simple message here. Freedom of expression rights must be recognized and must be taken account of in this debate, wherever you fall down on it. Those rights exist and are enshrined in law both at the national and the international level. How can ICANN not recognize them? Now, to move beyond that, I disagree, and I think it's an important disagreement, but certainly an intelligible one, with Wolfgang when he says that the solution to these problems is to build a community around ICANN and reach consensus within this community as to what should be censored and what should not. I propose what I call the Reformation principle, which is, instead of building a religious community in Europe and deciding whether you're going to be Catholic or Protestant or dead, that both sides stood apart and said, we separate state from church. We do not try to dictate who is the right religion and what are the right words and what is the proper public morality and order. global level when you're dealing with TLD strings. The principle is one of tolerance and minimal, absolutely minimal forms of regulation. That is, if a Catholic kills a Protestant or vice versa, they're guilty of murder. It's not about religion. So that might include some kinds of speech, for example, conflicts with legitimate prior trademark rights, which are simply inimical to public interest to have going on. But it does not mean that you are simply trying to create a global consensus around certain kinds of norms or standards. We don't think that there will ever be a global consensus on norms and standards regarding proper forms of expression. Now that's a hard problem. That's a very hard problem, because I think the only way out of it is for ICANN to simply be a highly neutral technical coordination body that basically looks first and foremost as to whether there is a string conflict or not, and permits people to register things primarily on that basis, and then allows national laws and applications at the edges, which people can choose to use or not, to determine what kinds of strings get through to people and which kinds do not. Clearly that requires more work. But it is the right thing to do. It's something we have to do to protect the freedom of the internet. We cannot allow the core resources of the internet to be used as leverage to impose a global regime of control and censorship. So there's two very clear approaches to this problem. One says ICANN is the nexus of a global community that's going to impose its own norms and standards on the world. And the other one says ICANN is a neutral coordinator of lots of different people's views and should stay out of those kinds of disputes and let them be handled elsewhere. Now there's something very dangerous here about the relationship between governments and ICANN. And let me publicly accuse governments, who most of whom are probably not here, of laziness. Bertrand is here. We know that Bertrand is listening, and good listening, and we'll have things to say later. We know this. But I accuse governments of laziness. You see, here's the way it should happen. If governments want globally applicable norms regarding what strings or what words can be uttered publicly on the internet, they have to get together in a room and negotiate a treaty. They have to negotiate specific words and that are consistent with their own laws, and they have to get those treaties ratified by their own democratically elected national legislatures. And they probably know as well as I do that that may never happen. And if it does happen, it would happen 15 years from now. But it probably would never happen. I mean, look at who you're talking about. The United States, China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Denmark, the Netherlands. Can these people all agree on what are the proper norms of freedom of expression? So what's dangerous about this situation is that they can use ICANN as a way to avoid making real public policy, making real treaties and laws, and they can simply express displeasure at something. And then we all get intimidated and we back down, and that regime of censorship is much more effective, and believe me, the Chinese government knows this very well. That kind of indirect encouragement of self-censorship is much more effective and repressive than actual explicit legal censorship. But it's all, I think, about governments. Basically, governments, some of them are afraid that words that they don't like will be entered into the new TLD space. I have heard a particular government that you can probably guess worry, what if someone wants to register .jihad? I have heard, we saw that some governments didn't like XXX. We have governments that are concerned about religious and cultural terms. And so, yes, these governments have legitimate concerns about terms that might be offensive to them, that might be sensitive in their culture, that might be even illegal in their culture. But the question is, how are they going to exercise this power globally? Or should it be global? I'm suggesting that if they're going to exercise that power legitimately, that it should be exercised first at the national level, and if it's going to be global, it has to be done through a formal negotiated treaty in which they write down what they're doing, they go through democratic and accountable process, and they get it ratified by democratic national legislatures. And then and only then can they tell us what words can and cannot be in the top-level domain space. Personally, I think people put way too much emphasis on the existence of a string in the top level. There is a .jihad in the second level. There is a .jihad in the third level. The word jihad can appear on websites. It can be uttered in people's speech all over the world. It can be on bumper stickers. It can be on posters. It can be on television. The idea that the world will surrender to terrorism because there's a top-level domain is obviously a bit crazy. But it's this collective process of recognition that worries everybody. People think, well, if we recognize XXX, if we all go through this process of ratifying it, then suddenly we're sort of legitimizing what's there. But that's not true if you are a neutral technical coordinator of the internet. You are simply accepting applications for strings, making them meet certain criteria, and if they meet those criteria, they go in, and the regulators and governments worry about the other issues as we go forward. So that is my perspective. I appreciated Wolfgang's historical background. I think it was a very good contribution, and in this debate I'm very happy to have the namesake of the British philosopher and poet who took one of the more extreme, but I think one of the positions that really helped to move this world society forward in greater freedom and progress. Thank you.